Nice to come in after such a controversial vote after whether or not to wear our coats.
You notice how I
And
came
that
down?
does not apply to
Right, I was gonna
committees.
say,
Yeah.
people who did.
Welcome
You're
we're
live.
live.
It's perfect.
Welcome everybody to a joint hearing of the House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development and the House General and Housing Committee. What we're gonna do today is essentially take ourselves through the portion of the housing bill, which is the vehicle we're using is the Senate Bill S.127. We're not going to go through the entire housing bill. We're going to focus on the piece of the bill that refers to tax increment financing, and specifically to CHIP. And what we're going to do is we have three distinguished gentlemen with us today. Charlie Kimball, who's a member of House Ways and Means and is the reporter for the House Ways and Means amendments to the bill. Herbie Keaton, and Patrick Titterton from Ledge Council. It's not, no, Patrick Ledge, JFO. Ledge Council, excuse me. It's fairly warm in here, and despite the vote on the floor, I just want you to know that that rule does not apply to committees. What we're going to do today is walk through the bill carefully. And this is really, I urge members to keep an open mind today. I know lots of people have questions. And I think questions are the most important thing here. If you want to introduce your question with a concern, of course, but I think we really want to focus on questions. I want us all to leave here with the same understanding of what is actually in the Ways and Means Amendment. I really feel that there has been a certain amount of misunderstanding about what's here and what isn't here. I'm not asserting that the misunderstanding is the source of everything, but I want us all on the same page when we leave here. I think it's really important. We will not today be taking straw polls or polls of any sort. So this is a chance to ask questions. Do not hesitate to ask, and don't hesitate to interrupt. If you have a question, just raise your hand and I will recognize you. What have I forgot?
Clarification, are we going to go through the whole TIF part of the bill or just the changes that Ways and Means has made to the bill?
I can help with that. John Gray, is the counsel in this, I'm filling in for John, by the way. So I'll do what I can here. He had prepared a side-by-side, and so I thought that would be the most convenient way for you to compare the changes.
Right, I think what you want to do is you go through it. At this point, we've all, shall I say, worked on this bill a lot. So we're pretty familiar with it. And so what I would do is you can walk us through the bill, but focus on the changes.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah, they're all highlighted.
Right. And I think that all three of you should feel free to chime in response to questions. And also, Charlie, I think you should feel free to chime in at any point with a background explanation, et cetera. We really want a full hearing on this,
Thanks.
on the differences. Does that work?
Should we ask Representative Kimball to provide us an overview before we look at the words?
I think that would be excellent.
Maybe give two committees an idea of what Ways and Means was thinking when they made these changes.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Markup. Happy to meet with you. It's I've never heard so many people trying to figure out how far they are from the settlement here in the halls. My half a mile, my quarter mile to figure out if my development or my town can have a community and housing infrastructure program. Ways and Means got the bill from as it came out of House General and Housing, and we had very vigorous discussions about the very value of tax increment financing in the weeks before, and heard from people such as the state auditor, the top state economist, and also from housing groups. So we have people on both sides of whether or not TIF in and of itself makes sense from a state perspective. So what we really were looking to do is to put some meaningful, reasonable guardrails around the use of the statewide education property tax, so as to not to create too much of a future liability on the education fund. So that's the purview of the Ways and Means Committee. So that's what we're looking to do, is establish what those guardrails are. So there are a few things that we did that are different than that. One is to look at establishing a but-for test. I'm only going to hit the highlights because the other stuff is, the but-for test is a normal part of any kind of tax increment financing program administered by the Vermont Economic Progress Council and also the Vermont Economic Growth Incentive Program. And that is just to say that if not for this particular financial instrument, then the development would not have occurred or would have occurred in a significantly different manner or delayed. That is what the purpose is, and that's to determine that state funds are necessary for this development to occur. That's the intent of including the but-for test, really suggested by the auditor. We're willing to attest to the fact that it's not always auditable, meaning that you can't always prove that the but-for is true or false. Number one, eligible locations. When it came to us, it was for tier 1 and tier 1A and tier 1B, and also had a reference to tier 2, but in a future state where the improvements might make it eligible for tier 1. We reviewed that and looked at the existence right now of, is there tier 1A or tier 1B, and they are not created yet. There's a long time frame for those districts to be created. They won't be effective until January 1st, 2027. So what we did is we reverted to some of the language that's already in the bill to look at those designated centers that are currently exempt from Act 250 as made possible by Act 181, and also look at existing settlements, which is the half mile from an existing settlement for the where you could locate a project that is eligible for the CHIP program. Next, and that's fairly expansive. I mean, that doesn't just mean a designated center that you have now, but also a cluster of homes, everything that is a denser kind of settlement, except for strip development. So it explicitly says no strip development, and that's currently in statute. We changed the requirement of floor area to 65% of the project must be dedicated to housing. And 65% seems random, except when you think about our concept and looking at it was, you've got a 3-story building, the first floor is commercial, has to be able to support the total project, and the 2 floors are going to be residential. So that's where we came up with 65%. We recognize that there are some really different types of redevelopment that could occur, like for a school or for another building, a commercial building, which there could be a gymnasium or a theater. And we're leaving that up to BEPC and rulemaking to figure out how to apply that 65%. So hopefully that's all right. Next is to look at the retention rate. As it came to us, it was a 75% retention of the tax increment financing, tax increment. And we adjusted that to 60% for all projects, and also kept in what had come to us from House General and Housing, which is an additional increment if it meets the definition of you had affordable housing. We've inserted middle income housing. I'll tell you why in a second. Okay, now I'll tell you. So middle income housing, what we were looking at is that there was testimony that we took that all housing has to be built. It's not just low and middle and moderate income, which limits it to less than 120% of area median income, but middle income housing, which is 150% of area median income, as defined by Vermont Housing Finance Agency, that you could use that to create housing that's needed and freeing up other space that's also needed for low and moderate income. So we thought it was more expansive. It's just broader. So we're going to all housing all the time without looking at high-end housing or high-income housing. Let's see. We limited the use of the funding to focus on those infrastructure projects that are most common. So there were some things that were in the bills that came over that we thought were not really that integral to the development of that project, but really to focus on the development of housing units themselves. And there, so that was where you'd find, let's see, installation and construction of wastewater and stormwater systems, public roads, streets, bridges, multimodal facilities, public transit, so it goes on and on. And we added back what had been taken out originally is to digital infrastructure and telecommunication services. So that had been taken out, we put it back in. We may have taken it out, can't remember. Then we require that any excess cash flow from the development is retained in the tax increment special account. This part of the bill is you send it over. There's nothing different there. And then you can adjust the increment after 5 years to determine whether or not there should be a higher increment or a lower increment. Actually, just a lower increment, not a higher one. And this is the part that most people have a question about, and that is on the cap. We felt that it was necessary to limit the exposure to the statewide education property tax. And that left without a cap, we could face then higher property taxes across the state if the projects didn't necessarily work. So one thing about TIF, or CHIP in this case, is you have to believe that the value that's generated within the district or within the project would not have occurred except for the infrastructure that you put in place. And that is highly debatable. But we felt that we needed to put a cap on the project. So what was the cap? Is it number of projects? Is it geographically oriented? So we said, what if it's equal to 1 penny on the tax roll? And that 1 penny in the grand list is equal to $14 million, 13.9, but let's round up to 14 million. So that in any 1 year, you wouldn't have more than $14 million of foregone revenue from the statewide education property tax. Working backwards, because how could VEPC, the approving body, then manage that? Really hard to calculate, really hard to keep track of what that means. So we've tried to provide something that in the end, I think was more confusing, which is what is the lifetime increment retention for all the projects approved in 1 year? We said that should equal no more than $40 million. Remember, that's the lifetime increment. That's not the investment value of the projects. So that's how we backed into it using a few things, the non-homestead rate, what the retention rate is. And then JFO went so far as to provide a spreadsheet. And I think Pat's going to talk to you about that, is what that looks like. But it's important to think that if 40 million, you could back into what does that mean in any 1 year for investment. And if you assume 0% property tax increase over the 20-year life of the chip, that would be about $240 million and an additional investment in that year. $240 in 1 year for 240 million. If you assume a 5% increase in property taxes every year for that 20-year period, then that's worth $145 million. Because then every year you're growing and you're actually retaining more in that increment. That makes sense, people? Anyone? Yeah.
It's also returning more due to the increase in the valuation.
Yes. Right.
All right. But I also get confused a little bit. I appreciate your clarity on this, because the 40 million, getting to that number has been a little confusing for me.
Yep.
And so maybe when we get the JFO stuff, we'll get a little more detail there to make sure that we're all fluid points and we're a little broken English right now.
And it makes total sense. We've had a lot of difficulty in our committee in getting everybody onto the same page with that information as well. And it's complex and trying to figure out how much increment is going to be retained to repay bonds that are taken out to support these projects. So there are a lot of assumptions that are built in. And what we really don't know is how much uptake there's going to be, how quick, when they're going to be built, how long they're going to be built. And so I've listened to Pat's presentation a number of times, and I don't want to spoil any of his information because it's really good. But so it's good to think about an $80 million project, just for giggles. And if you had an $80 million project, remember, this is the incremental value over the original taxable value. An $80 million project would have how much in retained increments from this education fund over 20 years. And that value is about $17 million, not accounting for a 5% increase. Pat, sorry. Okay, so an $80 million project
Over 20 years.
over 20 years would retain for increment to repay the debt, $17 million. Okay, so that's out of $40 million that you're gonna have in any cohort in any 1 year, that one project, $80 million, which is a huge investment, is $17 million. And we've got that cap at $40 million a year.
Charlie, I think a lot of people are wondering, not about the increment, because they don't fully understand it. They just want to know, how much investment will this support overall in housing? And
Yeah,
I've heard various numbers, but one of them was well north of $1 billion. Can you sort of talk about that? What level of investment in housing would this yield?
so thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think there's two ways to approach it. If you just work backwards from the $14 million in annual increment, that's at its peak, is how much you're retaining. If you work backwards to figure out what does that equal to, it is well over $1 billion
Over what period?
over 20 years. So
Okay.
that's a significant investment. It's over $1 billion, depending on if you include that 5% inflator. It was 1.5 billion. I think including the 5% reduces that. So let's say $1 billion. So that's a pretty significant, but here's the two important things. That represents the investment, not just in the infrastructure, but the investment made in all of the housing development by the developers. That's the value of all the housing created. In terms of the infrastructure that is paying for, I'm not sure of it. I don't know, but the increment is paying for that. So, you know, CHIPS and TIF, when they're working really well, they're generating enough money from the actual property taxes that are being paid on that property to pay for the bond. So it's a self-financing tool when they're working well. Sometimes they don't work that well, but most of the time they do work that well. I hope that answered the question on the,
Well, in terms of, not over the lifetime, but I want to go back, I think you mentioned a number. What's the amount of housing investment in a year that this would allow in the capital investment in infrastructure? What is the 40 million per year turn into in terms of the amount of investment in a year it allows?
so we don't know. We only know the value of what could be invested in the housing to result in that kind of increment. So it depends on for financing
okay,
infrastructure,
right.
you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
what is that?
So that's anywhere from 145 million to 240 million every year,
Every year?
every year.
Right.
And in this, what you're gonna see with the numbers, it's 5 years, 5 cohort years of projects that could be approved in any one of those years, because we're looking at this, it did insert the word pilot to make sure that this proves out. That it's having the intended results that we want from the program.
So I think for clarity's sake, when we're talking about $40 million cap, that's a per year cap and not a cap of 40 million over a 5-year period or 8-year or 10-year period when the sun sets.
That is 40 million per year that BEPSI can approve based on the plans that are put together in an application to BEPSI of saying, here's my project over the lifetime of the application, over the lifetime of this project, it's going to have an increment capture of what? And so BEPSI will have that information in front of them. And currently, all the tax increment financing applications have to go through that process as well. What is the initial original taxable value? What do I think the investment is going to be at the end based on that? And they have an annual report that shows what that is. And the tax increment financing report, I happen to have a copy because it's, it's really almost required reading in Ways and Means. So, I mean, they have this, and I'm sure it does in Commerce too. So every year they put out a statement of just looking at what the original value was and what the assumed value was at the end. So Winooski is a district that just finished, right? Winooski is now retired. It started in a long time ago. They estimated that they would have $78 million in value at the end of their TIF, right? Their actual value was $103 million. So
Of new property.
of investment. Right. New property investment, that is the value of the properties that are in that district, in the TIF district.
Yeah. And for the infrastructure expansion.
Yes,
Okay.
right.
Herb?
So Charlie, I'm just trying to get my head around, the cap and what it applies to. I know we've heard some testimony from a developer developer in Burlington. Nice looking project and everything, so they were hoping to be able to use. You take it, I'm trying to figure out, it was a pretty big project though. Do you have any sense of how much of a cap would be used for that kind of a project?
So that's where I use the $80 million, because if it's the same project I'm thinking of that you might be thinking of, some of the numbers I heard were anywhere from 80 to $60 million. And anywhere from a
Annual or total?
total investment of the projects. This is what we're gonna spend on this project, anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 units. That sound familiar? Without naming the specific project.
What do you want to do?
I'm sorry, but that 80 million initial investment that they would be making in their housing project, and might have a first floor of commercial maybe, then that increment value over the 20 years would be about $17 million. That's the total retention over 20 years. So in that cap of 40 million, that's 17 million of them. Now, a few years ago, we had a housing bond, what was it, $35 million? We thought that was enormous. Gigantic. And now here we are talking about $240 million.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to get the reason why I asked the question, I'm trying to get my head around, how many housing projects will be capped? Be able to account.
It's a good question because it's almost impossible to know. Because you've got so many different layers of finances in each project. You don't know what the exact development costs are for each one. It could be anywhere from $10,000 to $70,000 per unit, depending on how big it is, where it is, the complexity of the installation. So don't know. I've heard figures from those that are trying to make a pencil out anywhere from 1,000 up to 5,000. But what we have to look at, is it a meaningful financial contribution towards the development of housing? I'd say the answer to that is unequivocally yes.
If I'm understanding the math correctly, and as general housing often hears testimony on how it's almost impossible to have things pencil out.
Pencil out, yep.
If I'm doing my math correctly, that's going to be roughly 580 homes at, if we're saying, $500,000 per home per unit. That's kind of what we hear often. If we're looking at the 240 million.
240 million, yeah.
Can you speak up just a little bit? Sure. So I guess my question is, did your committee have any testimony on what our expectations are, for homes or that we need to see? So we have all of these goals that each town needs to hit and where we're trying to get. And I guess I'm just not seeing how, and I'm not a math person, please understand that, how 580 homes helps us.
It's not 580. So let's work backwards for a minute. Remember, the uses of this money is only for the infrastructure necessary to build a project.
Right.
Correct.
So we're talking about the infrastructure itself,
Correct.
not about the total cost of building the units. So that is separate pockets of money. Could be the developer going out to a bank. It could be other equity, other financing stacks that are involved with actually constructing the housing. This is really limited to providing that infrastructure that makes that possible.
So the 240 million is the amount of money that is, it could vary.
Yeah.
But the 240 million is the amount of capital available to pay for infrastructure, right?
No,
What is it?
That's the
Oh,
amount,
that's the value of the units?
that's the incremental value. Right, that's going to drive higher property taxes
Right,
on
that's,
those
that's
units.
the increment.
Right, to then drive how much money is available to support the bond for infrastructure. So I don't know if, and I know JFO doesn't want to do math on the spot, but in terms of how much money is required to provide infrastructure is going to vary between every single project. It's not going to be the same. So can't tell you as to exactly how much that is. So I imagine we could probably go back and do the math and say on in 1 year, it's $1.2 million. And what's the debt service that could be provided, the service by 1.2 million? I think that's really what might be helpful in that sense as to how much is it being paid for in that.
I think it would be helpful. We know that there's always a lot of assumptions built in. But I think people are less concerned, well, about how much increment is generated, how much increment, what are the limits on increment? I think people want a sense of the range of the number of housing units that this would facilitate by financing their infrastructure. And one way to do that is simply to make a very rough assumption about the amount of money that is spent on infrastructure, for average amount of money spent on infrastructure for an average project on a per unit basis. And I think we could put together, I would think, such an assumption. And it would generate for you, what she was reaching for is, how many units are we talking about here? And I think if it's, $5,000 a unit, it's gonna be a lot of units. If it's $5,000 in infrastructure per unit, it's gonna be a lot of units. And it would be good to know that number. That's what people want to know. They
Sure.
want to know how many units to facilitate.
I understand the point you're making, Mr. Chair. I also understand the fact that it's almost impossible to know. It would be wrong, no matter what number we came up with, but, because I've heard different calculations as to, is it 2,000, is it 6,000, how many is it? From people that are looking at the numbers in different ways. I guess what we're talking from House Ways and Means, our approach was what is reasonable for the state to commit
Right.
from the statewide education property tax to support infrastructure, to support housing development. And if that number is not $14 million a year, what is it?
Right.
Yes.
Just to add, I think what we're trying to do is have a program that works anywhere in the state. And anywhere in the state is not going to build the exact same housing structure, amount, all of that, right? So what we're trying to do is say to you, all of you, tell us how much housing can we build in the state for this amount of money? And what you're going to say to us is where, right? Like, do you want us to put together a hypothetical if we did it in, these 20 towns and had projects, and this town can hold 20 homes, and this town can hold 100 homes, and this town wants 6, and right? And so all of those costs are going to be different, and all of the amount, it's going to be different. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
It's all going to be different. And this is not a tool that is going to be suitable for every single project. Tax increment financing and CHIP is necessarily complex. Just think about the auditing requirement. And if you think about separating the taxes and the original taxable value, having to report every year, this is not just a simple process. It can work for projects, and it just has to be proven to pencil out for them. So I know where you're going, and all we're trying to say is we think this is a valuable tool as well. But we're saying there's got to be some kind of limit on it.
I know Leonora had a question.
Leonora, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm still concerned. And maybe because it just hasn't become as clear to me yet. That putting the cap may exacerbate the trend of building in communities that already have more capacity. And at the same time, it feels unnecessary because by building more housing, we will maybe not, it still doesn't feel like a drain to the ed fund. Just with the way the logic of the CHIP program works. And I'm still stuck on the but for argument.
It is, long debated as to whether or not TIF programs or vegging, veggie is different, that's income, but TIF programs, the quote is to steal from the ed fund. It is foregone revenues. It is a tax expenditure, which in some ways is the same as an appropriation because it's revenue you don't have, but it is not an appropriation. So I understand what you're saying. And part of the rules that we have asked DEPSI to make in this is to make sure that one, that the program meets the purpose of creating more housing. Two, there's some geographical equity in it to make sure that there's housing, not just in one area of the state, but other areas. That it addresses blight, and it also looks at the, fills the necessary affordable housing elements, or creates more housing where it's needed, where there's a shortage. So in that is to make sure that we're not just looking at one geographic area, but that every area of the state is benefiting from it. So right now, TIF districts, there's 9 active TIF districts. And the annual foregone revenue of the state is about $6.5 to $7 million. It's not everywhere. There's a new one just approved for Rutland. Williston is looking for one. Newport's looking for one. Springfield is looking for these TIF districts. We've put a geographic limitation on the number of districts that could be created because of the concern over the impact on the education funds. So this is a lot more expansive than that. It's twice the amount that's what currently in TIF. So where we're thinking that this is probably a good number, 14 million.
Yes.
I just have a quick follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
So do I still have it, do you still have in the amendment that 30% of the increased property value does go to the state and to the,
But the way that tax increment financing works is part of it's retained to pay the education fund, and that right now is 60% for those districts that are not affordable.
40%.
Well, sorry, the retained, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So the amount retained from the education fund is 60%, and then if it's affordable, it's 80%.
wait, can you just clarify, because it's passive voice is retained, so who gets what money? If
Okay.
you could just say,
All right,
so $100 million
Let me give you a
property value.
specific example.
Thanks.
All right. So you've got a parking lot that you want to renovate into 50 housing units. And you need to invest, you need the infrastructure to do it. So you get a loan to do the infrastructure. You're a municipality. So then a developer comes in and develops a project. And that project on that property, after you put the infrastructure in, is going to be $1 million of tax revenue. Let's just use round numbers, right? $1 million. So of that $1 million in tax revenue, the amount that would be sent, that would be retained to pay for the bond, to pay for that infrastructure, would be $600,000. Okay, 60% of it.
So when you say is retained,
Okay,
where is that money living?
okay, all right.
Where's
That's
So,
your problem is the word retained.
all right,
Yes.
It means retained to pay for the bonds, not retained for the ed fund. The amount retained for the ed fund is 40%.
now let me go back. So it's one developer and they have to pay the $1 million. They pay it to the town, like we all do right now. We pay that tax to the
Right,
town, and
yeah.
the town
Yeah.
remits to the education fund. The town then takes that, it's going to say, you know what, 60% of this money, I'm gonna keep to pay for the bonds. If the town took it out, or if a private developer took it out, which is possible in the construct of the bill, then they could remit that payment, that money, the 60%, that's $600,000, to the developer who took out the loan to repay the loan. The other $400,000, if it's a statewide education property, gets sent to the education fund.
Right,
Right.
and that amount would not have gone to the education fund at all had they not built the housing.
Yes, and that's the debate.
Contributing to,
That is the but for debate.
That's the but for.
Right,
Some
so when
people-
we say that, when you calculate, I just want to clarify, so when you calculate the loss to the ed fund, are you including? Is that is that only the 60%?
Yes,
Or is it the whole 100%?
60%.
The 60%?
Right.
Okay, and so the ed fund would stand to gain.
Yes, the other 40% is being paid in. Right. Yes. And it's also important to remember the other increment withholding. Sorry, let me step back. You pay $1 million, let's say it's 100,000 because it's going to the municipality. So the municipality, again, they collect the property tax, but there's a municipal tax. The municipality keeps on $100,000, 850, 85% of it. They keep 85% of it to also help repay the bond. And they keep the other 15% in this construct to pay for their other operating expenses. Because you have that many new developments and new apartments, maybe you're gonna have to have a new police officer, new ladder truck, whatever it is, to help support that development.
And now those people will have a place to live.
Yes, but we're just talking about how the numbers work on that.
Is there any other major, you were gonna give a sort of overview.
Yeah,
Are there any other major overview points you wanted to make besides but for eligible locations, 65%, 60 or 80% increment?
is fine.
The cap. Anything else you wanted to just point to?
It's in the last section that we affect, and that's the sunset on tax increment financing districts. So we put in a sunset to be able to review tax increment financing to make it expire on July 1st, 2028. And that is intentional to try to give us an opportunity to review the intersection of TIF and CHIP, and also what effects may be in place of what's going on in the ed fund, because we're not sure what that is yet, and also look at the federal funding sources. So it's an intentional review at that point in time.
What is the sunset, Charlie, in the current draft? I just don't know. What is
On the pilot.
what is the sunset on the pilot?
On the pilot, I'm sorry. So that is July 1st, 2030 or 31? December 31st, 2031.
31. Okay.
You bumped it up. The new thinking is, was that sunset on the chip part of it?
On the
Yeah,
chip
on
was
the chip,
31.
on the chip.
Because I was reading it differently. Maybe you can help me understand. I confess, I was looking at the prior draft.
Yeah, it's changed.
2.4, and it talked about, location eligible, Act 181 exempted areas, which as I understand it, will go away sometime around January 2027. So, I was looking at the sunset, I know it says something else elsewhere, but if only the exempt areas are eligible and they go away in 2027, doesn't that effective, 18-month program?
The line right below it says existing settlements. And that is any kind of designated center or settlement and half a mile from it. So it includes all those designated areas, but
Okay,
not.
so the exempted, projects, that goes away to 30%, but then you're just left with the existing settlements.
Yeah, which is more expansive.
Good, yeah.
It is.
Oh, it's a lot.
Okay. I understand.
So
It's not.
I've been trying to follow this as it's changed quite a bit, and earlier I was gonna ask, you said right now there's 9 TIF districts?
Yes.
Am I wrong that this amendment brings that back down to 6?
Nope.
That was at some point in the bill, wasn't it?
Really? No, no. I swear to God. So it's, now there's 9 active ones and they are, hang on a second. All right, I got, no, it's off the top of my head. St. Albans, Burlington Waterfront, Burlington City, South Burlington, Hartford, Killington, Rutland just got approved, Hartford, and did I miss anybody? Milton, no, expired, that's retired. Same with, the old Newport is expired and Winooski's retired. And we have coming online interest in TIF districts of Williston, Newport, Springfield. At least those are the people that reached out to me to say, what the hell are you doing? Excuse me, I mean.
I have a question on definition. We will walk through.
Yeah, we're gonna do that now.
Should we do it by ear? Should we?
We have a
go-
question down.
Yes, sorry.
A little bit further on in the side by side, I'm looking at section 26. So section 55, this is on page 30 of the side by side. I was wondering if you could clarify for me, decision is not subject to review. Decision of the council to approve or deny taxing and financing district. Was an administrative decision that is not subject to contested case hearing requirements and not subject to judicial review. So does this have bearing on the appeals process? What exactly was this being?
I'm gonna let council answer that question.
Hey, it means that, the CHIP will be treated like TIF when it comes to the approval process, which means that the appeals will not be allowed.
Okay.
Just got to submit a new application, right? That's, it's stuck to know.
Charlie, I think I heard you use the word license.
Yes.
First of all, why? Why would you use that word? And secondly, where is it? Is it in the amendment?
It's in the amendment. Often TIF districts are intended to address what is considered to be blight. And it could be, a piece of real estate that is in desperate need of rehabilitation. So it's not meant with any sense of socioeconomic, any kind of implication that way. So that's,
I think you could have just, in my opinion, I think you could have chosen a more specific and appropriate word than blight.
okay.
What would I have chosen? Like a delinquent property owner, or, I mean, there's like 10 different terms now that are more specific and more appropriate than last. Temporarily.
I think if we are going to walk through the side by side, we better do it. We have until 4 o'clock, so.
Okay.
And as we do that, what I think we want to focus on are the things we've been hearing about, but let's walk through. Make it a little bigger. Sure.
Good idea. All right. So once again, Kirby Keaton Legislative Council, we'll walk through the language. On the left, we'll be looking at the House General and Housing Amendment. And on the right, we'll be looking at the same language from the House Ways and Means Amendment, only the language dealing with CHIP. And let's get into it. At the beginning of the definitions, this starts around section 25 of the amendment, by the way, just in case you want to know the greater context. There's 2 definitions from the House General version that are removed, and that is because this distinction between low income and middle income as part of the incentive is removed by the Ways and Means version of things. Ways and Means is only using one affordable housing option for an incentive, an extra incentive.
Okay, I guess I have a question there.
Okay.
We're gonna skip around a little bit, but I think we can do that, because I think the members of these two committees, they know this stuff, okay? So we defined low income, we defined moderate income. Because the purpose clause uses the words low income and moderate income. You did not change the purpose clause.
It was changed.
It still says lower moderate. I'm not
That does.
talking about the but for, I'm talking about lower moderate.
That still says all
Okay, so
moderate.
my question is, does middle income include low and moderate?
It does.
It's cumulative?
I think the purpose section is more generalized language and it's not referring specifically to that definition.
Throughout this bill, I think still there are references to people concluding that it meets the purpose in 1907.
That's true.
So, okay, this set, well, fine. So middle income development means a development of low, moderate, or middle income.
That's the intent. Catches them all.
I think
It's intended.
it's meant to be more general and maybe that's something that could be.
Okay, yeah, but I
polished.
just want to know what your
Because
intention was.
I would say it definitely does not mean what the ways and means definition for middle income housing is, which I have pulled up here. Because that's very specifically a narrow version. It means housing that is subject to a housing subsidy covenant. And middle income housing development means a housing development in which at least 20% of the units are middle income
Right.
housing. So your general person is not gonna think, of course, middle. So the purpose section here seems lower moderate income. Oh, that must mean someone with a housing subsidy covenant. But that's, I think it's meant, that purpose language is meant to be broader than just that.
Yeah, question.
Yes, please.
So I was reading through as defined in 27 BSA 610, and I think it would be good for us to, it is not helping me understand what middle income housing is. And so we're out there, we much appreciated.
Sure.
27 sales. But not clear.
It's okay. Okay. I'm not gonna show it. Okay, so a housing subsidy covenant, are you familiar, I mean, should I start from, I'll start like with basics where like, it's a restriction on the property.
Yes.
And, like a conservation easement or something like that, there's a holder of that. And then that property is meant to be forever under that restriction. So in this case, it's a covenant, the purpose of which is to encourage the development and continued availability of affordable rental and owner occupied housing for low and moderate income persons. A housing subsidy covenant may be created during ownership or at the time of conveyance by the owner of real property on the condition of, and there's a list of conditions. I don't work in housing a ton, but VHCB is the holder for a lot of these covenants in the state. We might have housing trusts, I'm not sure, that could also be holders.
Would it be a subsidized private transaction of the 5 condition of there's 5 things, including an allocation of low-income housing tax credits? I'm just wondering, how does this fit what we're talking about here? And is this really just language that allows us to say there is therefore a perpetually lasting covenant, or is it in any way defining what middle income housing is besides being stuff that is subject to permitting?
So for the purpose of the added incentive, you would use this definition, and it would mean that at least 20% of the units there would have to have these restrictive covenants.
The covenant aside, it's 150%.
Middle income is generally considered to be 150% as defined by VHFA.
But it's not in the
It
definition.
is not in the definition.
Yeah, so that's my confusion. Is
Yeah, and I think that middle income of what's affordable housing, you have various definitions out there, so for those things, it's specific to look at what these definitions say for that.
I guess, so to be blunt, my concern is that defining it the 27 VSA 610 it does not help. I can't imagine it would help developers or anybody understand what is, to sort of, your comments about how we want to have that be moderate income, middle class, without reaching into the upper echelons. I'm just wondering if the language that is written here prevents us from having a $900,000 home that's subject to a covenant. And am I misreading something? I'm just not seeing
It's,
the connection.
I think the VEPC application would have to be specific about that to inform people. I also, this doesn't eliminate CHIP for any kind of project though, because this goes to the, extra incentive for the affordable. The extra bit of increment you can get for the,
Still a little
more
puzzling,
affordable.
but I miss.
Yes,
So when we're talking about the extra increment, the Ways and Means Amendment brought down the increment to like 60, is my understanding that? So this is just a 10% incentive, 20% incentive, so they can go up to
20%, yeah.
for middle or just low and moderate?
That meets the definition of middle income
Middle,
housing.
that meets the definition of that, okay.
I guess my question is, and I tried asking in our committee, but since you're a money committee and get the numbers, maybe you did. Were any of the projections done for 60%?
Yes, actually, all the projections were done using 60%. Correct? Yes.
So can I just follow up on that?
Yes.
So what you are asking specifically is, does this help pencil out the projects?
Does
And you heard that 60% would still help pencil out
the infrastructure.
the infrastructure. Yeah,
We felt that there was a need to have an extra incentive to focus on the housing that was gonna qualify for middle income housing or low and moderate middle income. So there was enough discussion about we need to create all housing or all projects. And that we wanted to focus on providing extra incentive to get that income restricted housing.
and so enough of an incentive means that you want to lower, without eating too much into
That's right.
our tax funds, you chose to lower rather than saying, oh, I get to keep
100%.
Right.
90% or 100%.
That seems like a policy choice.
Okay.
But 40, I think the question to follow on here being asked is, in the past, TIF used 70%.
Yep.
The number 60% has never been used. Did you do any modeling or was any testimony produced to you that showed that bond issues that would support infrastructure pencil out at 60% as opposed to 70%?
Mr. Chairman, we did not take specific testimony regarding that. We have experience with TIF that showed that Winooski was at a 98% tax increment retention rate, and others have been at 90%. So looking at where we've been over time, we were trying to figure out the retention rate that made sense for developments that may not qualify to advance the purpose of the chapter.
Yeah,
So we were looking at how going from either 0 or something above 0 in terms of retention. We thought that 60% was a reasonable level, especially following testimony given to us by the state auditor and state economist.
but when you say Winooski was at 98% or whatever.
Yes, they were.
I'm sorry, I just don't know enough. Help me out. 98% of what for what?
That was 98% retention of the statewide education property tax to repay their debts.
To repay their debt. So they went way over.
Yes,
They went way over the 70%
that's right.
and were permitted to do so to repay their debt.
It was before the ground rules were put in place to bring them all in line to any new TIFs to 70%.
That's why the ground rules were made.
Right, okay. Yes.
And so that, when you say that 98%, you're saying this is a really bad situation for the ed fund or for the state tax, because they basically only got 2% after all this new construction, and that's gonna affect state coffers. And my question is, was did that happen because were the homes not low to moderate income housing? Or were there no guardrails like that in the TIF?
It's, the types of not necessarily.
Right.
So just,
Yeah,
Right, so Winooski, I can't speak to the original application, but they had a compelling application, I believe, in terms of redeveloping their central business district. And that's what the TIF was really intended to do, and create a significant number of houses. There was disparity in a lot of the retention rates across different tax increment financing districts that the legislature and BEPC agreed need to be tightened up. And so that was when 70% was considered to be a compromise, with an eye towards how much was going back to the education fund as well.
so why it was 70% considered a compromise for a big tip?
Mhm.
Or I guess I just don't understand why you go back down to 60.
The committee believed that 60% was, a more appropriate level after the testimony they received.
From somebody who does not like it, correct?
For someone whose job it is to evaluate the effectiveness of TIFs,
Okay.
including our joint fiscal office.
When we talk about middle income, affordable housing, the 80% retention rate, and we talk of, so that's perpetually affordable. So a person purchasing a home in that range is only allowed to make X amount of dollars if they want to sell that property. So they're gonna lose the equity that's built up in that home. They can only make so much in order to keep it perpetually affordable.
I think we'll need to look at what the wording is about the initial offering.
Okay.
There's no concept of a shared equity restriction on these property developments.
Is the question about the housing subsidy covenants and what can be restricted?
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering with that affordability clause in there, who's going to buy the homes that are being built under those covenants? If they can't get the equity out of the property.
They're
Some
they're
point.
typically subsidized in the first place. That's why they're considered more like affordable housing. And so that loss of ability to get equity is factored into what it costs in the first place. So theoretically, people who, maybe this is supposed to be a $200,000 home, you can't afford one because you can't afford any home in this market, but you can afford one that's 150 if it has one of these covenants on it that reduces the value and makes it 150. And the covenants tend to, I'm looking at the law here, it's not set, it's a contract, right? With some, so they could be different from covenant to covenant, but yeah, it's restrictions on the use of real property. Basically, it's to keep them as residential and to not change how they're used as residential is the core of what those are about.
So it's not a financial. It's not, so if I purchased a home, as long as I sold it to someone that's going to continue to use it as a primary home, then I still retain the equity that I built up in that home. Is that correct?
It depends on, like, you're talking about a contract that could vary from transaction to transaction, so it's hard to just give you a flat answer to that.
This is neutral on that.
Yeah.
stuff.
Okay.
I
All
think
right.
we were looking at the in perpetuity
Yeah.
as part of the housing infrastructure agreement. But that's in perpetuity to be a primary residence, not in perpetuity to be affordable at middle income.
Yes, and
I think that's how it reads.
what page of the,
1909,
right,
section 1909 or Because originally, it was how primary housing initially offered. And then it got changed to primary housing offered exclusively in perpetuity, so primary housing in perpetuity.
Qualified domicile in perpetuity. I believe that you didn't change those words from what came over to us.
So it
You
came
did.
over. You did.
It came over not in perpetuity
Right.
as offered.
Yes, that's
It was for the
correct.
life of the
Of-
loan,
It's-
whatever bond is.
The house housing version, was that it had to initially be used for
Right, out of
housing.
the initial,
And this is changing it so that it has to be forever used as housing.
go ahead.
But just to be really clear on that, sorry, but the middle income, that if you get the extra increment, the extra 80%, you sell the middle income homes at the affordable rate to begin with. And then as they increase in value, the owner of the home can sell it for whatever the market can bear when they sell it. On the affordable or on the middle income house.
It's, I believe that that's possible.
Yeah.
Reading all the pieces, I believe that that's possible. I haven't read the housing subsidy covenant statute to prevent, like.
Yeah.
equity.
You should read that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Right,
thank
yeah.
you.
You should read that. You can
Emily,
pull that up.
Yeah. You have a question over there?
Can we pull up that statute just so that we can all,
I can share it with the chair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, just helpful refresher here for people who want to know the context. This statute applies for the extra 20% of increment to be retained for the incentive, right? It's not.
We'll have to make it bigger, I'm afraid.
It's not every project.
it's hard to tell how you would apply it to your project.
Okay.
Is it my turn?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any other but for on any other types of infrastructure, sewer, transportation or things like that?
TIF has the.
All tax increment financing.
And there's a history of the state auditor, for instance, criticizing the Buffalo test
I'm familiar
in the
with the
context of TIF.
criticism. We have it in my community.
Right.
And it works really great.
Oh, South Burlington, forgot to say South Burlington. You did. I did say South Burlington? Okay.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, go ahead, Tom.
So, perpetual affordability is one of the programs that some of the agencies provide for, which I think is what some of us have in mind when we see in perpetuity. If I understand you correctly, we're referring to the S.127 with regard to the use. This is a different question than being perpetually affordable. The intention here, if I'm correct, is to be perpetually residential.
Yes.
Is that what this covenant is, middle income housing is subject to a housing subsidy covenant instead of the SA? And here we are, where is this tied to income? Low income housing tax credits, which is the tax credits, so let me finance.
It's not necessarily tied to income, it's tied to a house that's affordable.
So this is not also prescribing what those limits should be. Each could be different,
Depending on the finances.
depending on this funding stack. It could be depending on the development, where it is, that kind of stuff.
So.
So it's pretty open-ended.
Okay, that's why I'm asking you. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, apologies.
I think we should go to
When we're offering these as a bona fide domicile in perpetuity,
Go to rotation.
so that they're primary residences are not second homes or rentals or whatever. Who's verifying that in perpetuity? And how?
So if there's a covenant agreement on the property, then it's gonna be the owner of the property. It's not gonna fall on the municipality to continue to monitor that. So in the case of an apartment building, whoever is managing that apartment building or homeowners association of the condo, then they're going to be enforcing what that looks like. There's a whole infrastructure agreement as well that spells out who does what. So we anticipated that would be in that agreement.
So if it's ownership.
Yeah.
As opposed to rental. It's the unit owner who's verifying it somehow.
As I was saying before, there's a holder of the contract, another party,
Okay.
like the HCB. And they will enforce that contract. They'll enforce that covenant if they need to.
Given the time here, I'm wondering if it would be okay with members of the committee if we asked you to walk through the sections on location. How does that sound?
Herb says yes.
Could you take us through the location? I think that would be valuable for you to walk us through and explain it as you go.
Can you give us page number then?
Yeah.
It's like page 11. Is where location. So this is, to give you some context, in deciding, whether to approve a proposed project, there's many steps that are being considered, and each step has, either one or more criteria. Location is one of them. So what the Ways and Means version does, I'm skipping the project criteria because that's a different thing, and Ways and Means did have changes there, but I was asked about location here. Is it removed all reference to location criteria that so there's one big change, which is the way that the House government, House housing amendment went was a person could pass this criteria if they showed up with Act 250 permits in hand.
Right.
Ways and Means removed it.
Why?
They just took out, there was a reference, they took it out.
There was,
Side by side.
and there was also, the Act 250 tiers in reference to those were also removed. This is the part about the permits. That's an Act 250 permit.
Okay, the reason why we took that out is that we didn't want the application to be contingent upon having the permits in hand. We want somebody to be able to apply to BEPC without the permits necessarily in hand.
Okay, I just want you to know for what it's worth, we did not interpret that section meaning that.
Okay,
We interpreted simply as saying wherever it should have been written as 1, 2, 3. It was just another criteria. It said, no matter what, whether you're 1A, 1B, whether you're whatever you are, if you happen to have an Act 250 permit, you could be in tier 2 anywhere. If you have an Act 250 permit, you're in. That's all it said. It didn't mean that everybody else had to have an Act 250 permit. It was just an additional thing, but I guess maybe it wasn't seen that way, right?
right.
Right, okay.
Glad we're all together now.
So there was, so the previous amendment did have an or, it was a 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah,
Ways and Means took those out, and so now I'll just read through what the location criteria is without the Act 250 references. BEPC shall review the housing infrastructure project application to determine where the house development is located within one of the following. One, an area exempt from the provisions of 10 VSA, Act 250, pursuant to specifically the interim housing exemption. Or an existing settlement in an area within 1/2 mile of an area within 1/2 mile of a settlement, as it's defined in 10 VSA 6001. And I can pull up that definition of settlement if you want, but I think you might be familiar with it because that is not new language. that was there before.
Again, because tier 1 and tier 1A and 1B is not fully defined in terms of rule, or the applications aren't actually open to municipalities, then they do not currently exist.
I just want to say, I understand this. I think year one is very similar to R1.
Mhm.
What we're essentially doing is saying the interim, I think the intention was to say, and this was our not being as precise as we could, an area designated in 1A and 1B now. In other words, they're the interim exemption areas. They're preliminarily mapped. It would have made them permanent, effective for CHIP purpose. And this one is doing the same thing. It's taking I don't think it's any different. And probably better. And 2 is the same, right?
So,
The 2 is the same, except, but there's a 3 that was included before that was
Right.
removed. Just the tier 2 Act 250 area.
Why was that removed?
Some reason, I think.
same reason, tier 2 isn't defined yet. It's defined but not mapped, we don't know what it is.
Question over here.
Yes.
Two questions, I mean, that particular issue seems you could solve pretty easily, drafting, in terms of, the way that, House General, managed it, and frankly, the way the Senate managed it, in terms of, well, yeah, that's not gonna happen till 27, but in the meantime, these are the areas that are also, eligible. And I'm just still curious about in the House General, definition, location, definition, it has that ISO section in there. And it basically says, if you have an active permit, or if you don't need one, right? Notwithstanding anything else in terms of the list there, you're gonna be eligible for CHIP. And that seems to be, and that seems to be a very big difference between what the general committee was saying in terms of the location, much broader than what you have. And I'm still struggling to understand, why you wanted to restrict us on.
Our interest was reflecting what the current law is, what the current districts are. That's all I can say.
Right, but there are ways, drafting wise, there are ways to deal with that.
Yeah.
And the Senate did it, and General did it. So at the end of the day, I think it's probably just a policy difference, right? In terms of where you wanna be, what locations you wanna have, and take advantage of the CHIP program. And in one version, I think your version, it's, existing settlements, dense areas, that kind of stuff. And in the other version, it's much broader, virtually, probably anywhere in the state. And I think that's maybe the main difference, but maybe you see it differently.
Well, it's interesting we're having this debate now, a year after the legislature vigorously debated where housing development should occur.
And I hear that, and this is another thing about smart growth, that'd be good to get that on the table, that's right. That's a fair debate. And different people are gonna have different opinions about that, I hear you.
We're in here. Excuse me, one other question, in the side by side. We also had. Or was it only 2028? One of the criteria we also had was that the project would, at the time of the approval, be mapped or application. Be mapped as a, what's it called? Transition and.
The interim exemptions? No.
I'll tell you what, I'll ask later. There was another criteria remember, but it only applied in 2028. Is that in this side by side?
I think that's much later with the contingent due date to tier two as of 2028, when tier twos
2028.
were fully mapped.
Yeah, and it was for areas that came out of our committee, areas that by then would have been mapped as something or other. Keep getting the names, transition, and, but it's not, okay. I don't have our original bill in front of me, so I withdraw the question. I can,
It's much later.
what do you want to do now? Should we go take another controversial
Yes, we should.
area? Well, we talked about the cap. You mentioned the sunset is now the end of 2031.
Right,
It was the end of 2030.
right. We extended it
A
after
year.
conversations about making sure that it gave enough time for rulemaking to be completed and then 5 years with the new rules in place.
Okay. Right. But now you assume the rulemaking will take a year.
Yes.
Okay, but there's no requirement.
No, it says they'll do it. It
Yeah,
could be faster.
yeah.
Sure.
Eligible locations. I think probably, should we look at the but-for language? Why don't we look at the but-for language? Just so we get down to the language. You want to walk us through the but-for language
Okay.
in the 10 minutes?
I found your, if you look, I won't go into it, but, the chair, what the chair was referencing, I believe is on page 29 of the side by side, if you want
Section 26.
to, yeah.
You think those areas was the cost?
Transition or infill area.
The transition or info areas would be included within the settlement language?
I can't speak to it.
Okay, all right.
Do we have anybody here that can hear?
What's the question?
Is the transition or infill area covered by the settlement? Do we think that the way the settlement is listed, that it also covers the transition or infill area?
Under Act 250 definitions? No, I would have to look into that. I'm sorry.
Yes, Tom?
Just one more question on the location. When we're talking about that half a mile of the settlement area, we're talking about half a mile from the edge of the settlement area?
Yes.
Yeah.
Boundary, yeah. Right now from the center. We even had a conversation with a representative from Fairhaven about a project that he would like to see in his area. And it's 100 housing units to go on the site of a former racetrack. And initially, he was told that it didn't qualify. And actually, it does qualify.
That's happened a lot, where people are worried something won't qualify, and it turns out it will. Yeah.
Okay, so the but-for test is included in the application approval process. It's on page 9 of the side-by-side, section 1910 of the proposed statute here, sub C.
I have a question on the but-for clause.
About to
For the
go over it.
past,
I was about to walk through it. Go ahead.
so in the past, we've done this with TIF, this but-for. Am I right in assuming that there were some TIF applications that were denied because of this but-for clause?
I can't speak to that exactly. There are many communities that express interest in tax increment financing districts that don't progress that far for a number of reasons. I don't know if but-for is one of them. Usually it's about the sufficiency of the increment that might be generated to repay the debt that needs to be taken out. I think that's the reality.
The veggie program is the other one that uses the but-for, and I would imagine that there's been a veggie application at some point that did not meet the but-for test.
Because what I would really like to know, because we can't predict what never happened. All these places that were denied out of, maybe there aren't any and we don't have any data, but I'd be curious to see, on a but for denial if that area developed at all?
That's a good question. I know in the veggie program, you can definitely point towards people who have applied or denied because of the background growth in their particular industry, and they went ahead and hired the people anyway. So it's a good question as to how auditable the but-for is. And we're willing to admit that it's not always that black and white.
Was this added? Was this added? Remember what, do you remember when the but-for test was added to TIF?
I don't know if it was 2006 when it was codified in law or when it was added, but, veggie was recreated from a previous economic development incentive program
Right.
that didn't necessarily have a but-for test. It was more of anyway, it was a revision to the program.
It's my impression, but just an impression, I've heard it, that number one, I don't think any TIF project has been denied because of the but-for test. But that the but-for test was put in place precisely because of earlier TIFs that failed. In the sense that the increment necessary to pay off the bonds wasn't generated by the development or a fear that the development would have happened anyway. They're almost opposite problems. But that's one of the big risks with TIF is, you pledge your full faith and credit that you're going to pay off these bonds. And then the development, well, the worst would be the development doesn't happen at all. Or the market falls apart, or they're not worth what you thought they were worth. And so the amount of increment, that's what must have happened that got Winooski to 98%, right? It's just, they needed every penny they could generate. Is that not right?
No, they were just, there wasn't any guardrails that we have now.
Yeah, well, now we have.
That created, that project is the reason why we have guardrails.
And including the ordinance perhaps.
That I don't.
Okay, all right. Why don't you quickly walk us through the budget?
This may surprise you, but I actually really support TIF.
Yeah, no, it doesn't surprise me. I understand that.
Okay, so in reviewing an application, BEPC has to, one of the many things that's to review is determine whether the infrastructure improvements that are proposed for the development that's proposed would have occurred as proposed in the application or would have occurred in a significantly different and less desirable manner than as proposed in the application, but for the proposed utilization of the chip. The review shall take into account, so this is like breaking down the parts of the but-for questioning. One, the amount of additional time, if any, needed to complete the proposed development, and the amount of additional cost that might be incurred if the project were to proceed without the increment. How the proposed housing development components and size would differ, if at all, including, if applicable, to the housing development and the number of units of middle income housing without education, without the chip increment. And third, the amount of additional revenue expected to be generated as a result of the proposed housing development, the percentage of that revenue that shall be paid to the ed fund, the percentage that shall be paid to the municipality, and the percentage of the revenue paid to the municipality that shall be used to pay for the improvements.
You have a question?
So the amount of additional revenue expected to be generated as a result of the proposed housing development, so section 3A. I guess my question is, the intent of CHIP is to provide a toolbox or to put another tool in our toolbox for all municipalities regardless of capacity. If BEPC is looking at, let's say, 3 different applications, they all look the same, except one of them has substantially more revenue going to go in. Is there a possibility that BEPC says no to the other 2, but because of this stipulation in the but-for, they say yes to the other one?
I can take a shot at it. So looking at this, it doesn't tell Vepsi how to cast a judgment on this information. And maybe that's something, because there's some info in here about Vepsi issuing rules around this, so maybe that's something that they would flesh out in the rules. But, assuming some things, looking at this, I might think if I were to review and I were to apply this language, I might think, okay, well, I know that the legislature's concern is how much the ed fund is losing. So if I look at these pieces of information and there's one project that stands out as basically needing less increment and more of it could go to the ed fund than the other two, maybe that would be a reason under this analysis. This analysis, it just gives you bits of information, such as if you have 3 projects and one of them is going to add a lot more value or a lot more housing than another one, maybe that's a factor. But I don't read this to tell Vepsi how to use this information to make a judgment.
Is it true? And I guess it's both.
Yes, at that first. What's that?
Is it true? And both of you guys are, my impression is this generates information. Here, 3 generates information. There's nothing in here in this act actually that tells Vepsi, that directs Vepsi which project, how to prioritize projects. Is that right?
There is a prioritization in the application process for them to consider whether or not it meets the housing needs,
Right.
identified housing needs, geographic equity, to
Right.
make sure that there are projects all over the state, to make sure that it addresses.
Can you bring that
What?
portion up?
Yes, that's in the Vepsi application process. I think it's 1610.
Yeah, or 19?
1910, yeah, that's right. But before we go on that point, Representative Bartley, I think that section is intended to indicate they have the ability to generate sufficient revenue from the increment to pay down the debt.
I guess that's not how I read it.
Yeah.
Because it says the amount of additional revenue expected to be generated as a result of the proposed house.
Right.
I'm really concerned that once again, rural communities
Yeah.
are getting shafted.
No, and that's not this at all. It's not
I think that's
compared.
the entire amendment, to be completely honest, and I'm trying
Oh.
to make sure that. So Act 181 was great. It's great, it's fantastic. We've seen how good it's worked for Chittenden County, Brattleboro, Middlebury, come from Fairfax in Georgia. Georgia doesn't have a designated downtown, and Fairfax can't grow because we don't have infrastructure. This is not going to help either of my towns again. And I'm really frustrated that we're putting so many barriers into something that could have been, still had guardrails. And yet we are just putting barriers in front of smart growth in our towns that we wanted. And I'm sorry because you guys are in the hot seat. But I'm here because I have to stick up for my towns, because when I do die, I want to make sure my towns are still there, and this doesn't do it for me. So I do see this as a detriment. I see that language as a detriment.
It's not how it's intended. And believe me, the Ways and Means Committee is completely agnostic on where the developments occur. So we've got good representation from rural areas of the state on our committee and those that are in urban areas. So it's pretty widespread. But this is about the ability of the town to be able to satisfy the debt requirement from that extra generated revenue. Because there are some TIFs that are struggling to meet their debt service.
Absolutely, but I also am saying that I think if you have 2 applications, one would assume that even if both applications have the ability to pay their debt services,
Yeah,
that they should both be approved.
sure, why not?
But this language makes me very concerned that that's not the case. If we're expecting one to receive more revenue, then let's use common sense. That's who's going to be more apt to say yes to that one than over the other one.
Remember, there's a geographic equity component.
Yeah, I'd like to see that language. Where is
It's
that?
right up there.
I know, but I can't read it. What?
Page 25.
Page what?
25.
Page-
Okay.
oh, Well, I was looking at the rulemaking, the geographic equity, I'm not, is it in this?
Where is
I
the,
don't know where it's like, regional equity, it's right there, on item 1.
Oh, okay, so this is something that has to be considered in rulemaking then.
Yes.
Okay.
The
governing the
prioritization of projects.
prioritization of applications, one, right? Flight, regional equity, verifiable housing shortages, and labor shortage.
We have a question over here from John, a question over there from Tom. We're gonna go 10 more minutes, folks, because we're
Okay.
at 4 o'clock.
So, John, President Brody's commentary, or the question is around 65%. The presumption was of 3 stories, and it occurs to me that thinking through municipalities, 3 stories I don't think is a given throughout the state for structures. Was that a point of discussion in Ways and Means around 50%? Almost every place can do 2 stories, but 3 is not automatic.
When we got the bill of 70%, so we lowered it to 65,
Yeah.
so it's actually more forgiving.
And I think, and I'm in a forgiving mood. So I mean, that's sort of like 50 would be something, knowing that 2 stories gets you somewhere, or gets you something much more applicable.
One of the things we can do, I just can tell you real quick. You guys had 60, we up to 70, they did 65. I know from my own life, my experience in work, if you want to get into floor area ratio, you got to define it very carefully. And that is beyond the scope of what we ought to be doing. I mean, it's like ages. So I think our intention, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you share this, is really VEPSI ought to adopt a rule as to what this means. And I think they ought to put in that reuse, it depends. You know, they should say something that just says if it involves reuse, that, it depends on the particular project and, it's really give a lot of flexibility on reuse. I think that we need flexibility. I don't know how we put it in the statute, but I think the regs have to be very flexible. Is that, Charlie, is that accurate that
Yeah.
we gotta look for things we share. We share that, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah, okay.
Put one on one column.
So I guess one thing to note here about the rulemaking in general is that, the Ways and Means version does require rulemaking.
Yeah.
Which was not,
We didn't have any.
Really?
Where does it say that?
it says,
It says may.
It says it may.
it says may adopt rules that are reasonably necessary. And then the next line, the council shall specifically adopt rules to 1, 2.
Okay.
On those 3.
So they may adopt rules about whatever they want,
Yeah.
but they shall
specifically
do
on
these other.
these
Yeah.
One.
Yeah.
Would be.
Thank you. That's
And there was some may adopt rules language in the other amendment as well, but,
Is there a definition in state statute of regional equity?
No, I'm sure there's not.
I think.
Along those same lines, just to put my comment, if you have projects, chip projects going in Bennington, Brattleboro, Rutland, White River, St. Johnsbury, and Williston, that's dispersed geographically, but it's not rural equity. They're different. Geographic equity is how are we covering the state accurately, but that doesn't mean that we're addressing towns of under 1,000 or 2,000. Because they can completely pass by and still achieve, a dispersion around the state. So I'm not sure, again, I'd like to see a definition, certainly in the rule.
And the rulemaking, right.
Well, it seems like a lot of guidance being taken out of the statute bill and made discretionary as far as that is concerned. Is there a reason all of this discretion has to go to that to not so much guidance?
Pepsi still has to come back with the actual rules.
And then we'll see what.
And part of it is to submit them right there on item number B on the page, is before submitting them to interagency committee on rules, is to submit them to the JFO office. Gypsy? JFC. Joint Fiscal Committee, yes.
Why did you add joint fiscal?
Because in the past, there have been emergency rules adopted by Joint Fiscal Committee when there wasn't enough time for the legislature to review them in full. So as to expedite the rulemaking.
This doesn't give expedited rulemaking authority.
Expedited approval process.
Well, generally, what happens, Elkhart, the chairs of the committees, the jurisdiction, get the rules. When it goes to Elkhart, there's a time for, I think JFO also has the ability to look at the rules. And the chairs have time to talk with legislative council to go through that and give their recommendations to Elkhart as well. So I'm wondering why you need that extra step.
I think it was skipping that step, honestly.
So it's not ringing a bell to you. It may have been, like John might be able to answer that because it may have been a drafting decision where he took that from somewhere else that Betsy does a similar process. And I can try to look at that, like find where he maybe got that from.
The intent was to expedite it, not slow it down.
Patrick, you've been sitting here patiently and we're almost out of time. Is there any highlight that you were gonna talk about that you'd like to talk about in the remaining 3 minutes?
Well, I'll
Forgive us for doing that to you, but I thought I'd ask.
No, certainly. So I guess I probably should introduce myself. Patrick Chitterton, Joint Fiscal Office, for the record. Yeah, I would just, you've probably heard Ted say this a bunch of times. This proposal in any of the states you've seen it, whether it's in your committees or this amendment, we're still not able to estimate a cost for it. Now, you do have the caps, right? And so I would just point to the cap that is not a cost estimate. It is more indicative of a limit on potential, the upper bound of exposure to the education fund. It's possible that you can't approve enough increment retention to hit the 40 million in each year. It's possible they can. But in terms of actual estimated costs, we're still not able to provide that for you. And I guess if you have any other questions about the cap or the accounting.
If we were to supposing we give you a low and a high number for the cost per unit of infrastructure. Okay, we give it to you. We say, assume a low of $2,000 and a high of $10,000 cost per unit. Would you be able to calculate how many units the $40 million of increment over the lifetime would produce?
If you're able to provide me with sort of, reasonable average per unit estimates, it's simply just dividing one number by the other.
I thought so. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
So if you Google it.
It must be accurate.
Yes, but
Is that an AI number?
what about
Can you
yourself?
buy infrastructure on Amazon?
I'm sure you could. It costs an average of $100,000 per home of infrastructure costs.
We did have a presentation on a development that was for the first 20 units, it was 75,000. For the additional 40 units, it was 24,000. So it's like, okay.
Yeah.
It was really hard to know what that was. And I think I might have the number of units wrong, but it gave that huge variable.
And it is possible that folks that maybe get the Bay or HCB might be
right.
best equipped to answer that particular question.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Just find $40 million a year
And approval spent.
Of increment.
of increment that can be used. And how, I'm trying to picture this. That you have, if this is truly something that small communities, so we need to make sure small communities can access it. What's the likelihood of hitting $40 million a year?
There are constraints as to how many projects can you really build.
Right.
And so that's one. I mean, the permitting process is something else again. Getting the other stack of the financial stack together. So all those are fairly complicated.
And did you talk about the possibility of, if the legislature is out of session, Betsy has a great project, but they've met the cap, that they could go to joint fiscal committee for approval to extend the cap?
We did not discuss that.
I'm just wondering if that's something.
I can't tell you what the value is of existing home projects that are under construction now. Could be. I know that there's 330,000 units that we have in the state. But I can't tell you how many in terms of total number of units. That's a you thing.
Yeah,
I don't know the answer to that.
we've got one time for your question and then that, I think we have to.
Then Herbie has to answer.
Herbie, okay. Oh, go ahead.
So the sub B under the rulemaking, someone must have asked for the legislature to take a look at it, because I found that, other areas of law, like, best management practices, rules relating to best management practices for agriculture, have statutory language to basically allow the legislature to take a look at the rules before pre-filing. So it seems like John would not have grabbed, that, he wouldn't have grabbed it arbitrarily. I think there must have been a request to have the legislature take a look at that. So that's why that's done with this.
Yeah, it wasn't, I don't think the problem was the legislature, it was joint business. Concern. Last question.
Well, I think the other side of the coin of the how our rural community is gonna take advantage of this is also how desirable is this? I mean, for a Burlington or a community that properties just are more expensive, they're gonna reach the maximum very easily with, bigger projects that are gonna produce property that is worth more. May not be able to take advantage because they might take up way too much of the cap, of the proportion. So here we've been trying to work towards adding more housing where there is already infrastructure, or where there is already, and we just like Champlain is getting garbage spewed, wastewater into it all the time, because we need, even in places where there is infrastructure, like Burlington, we need this infrastructure development. When they build a massive unit and we have this cap, it may not make sense anymore for them, because they may be told so it's just like, it's the other side of the coin of like, are we really solving any problem?
We
Well-
think we are, but obviously.
Any last statements by the three of you? We've got to stop.
You gotta get out of here, we're gonna go be stuck there.
Oh, yeah. Some of those are closed.
Oh, that's right. Corporate challenge.
440.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for all of your help. And this is obviously too short and good. And appreciate it. I have a feeling it's not the end of what you might get asked.